Hi, everyone. I am so happy and proud today to introduce you to our first Living Spirit of the month. And when I had this idea to highlight somebody in this way every month, I really wanted it to be somebody who embodies love for all in all that they do. And Reverend Stephen Symbolik does that and so much more. I first met Stephen when we were both students at One Spirit Seminary. And I knew right away that Stephen was somebody who had very important things to say in this world. More important, though, I started to quickly see that he also is somebody who walks the talk. And by that, I mean, he is somebody who will just send somebody a gift or a book in the mail because he knows that it will mean something to them, or a handwritten note, or just a text or a phone call with an inspiring message. And I thought for a while like he was just doing that for me, and then I realized he does that for so many people. And Reverend Stephen's vow is to share love and art and beauty with the world. And one of the ways that he plans to do this with his ministry is through his love for gardening. And Stephen holds both a bachelor's and a master's, and he finished his MDiv work at Washington Theological Union. He's also a certified master gardener, a professional florist, and he studied art in Urbino, Italy. So he's definitely qualified to talk about this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So welcome, Reverend Stephen.
Thank you, Reverend Garrett. I don't know if I have a lot to say, but I certainly think I have a lot to do. And that's where my emphasis is.
I think you do. I think you have a lot to say. So I'm curious to know, with your passion for plants and flowers, was that something, were they always sacred to you, or was it something that there was a moment when you established this kind of spiritual connection? And can you talk about what that spiritual connection is?
Sure. From my earliest memories, I have been connected to plants and flowers. I have a picture of me with my father the day before my first birthday. I'm just wallowing in roses. I was very lucky to grow up around gardeners. I had a next door neighbor who was an elderly man from Italy, and he graciously allowed me to come into his garden. It was a paradise for me when I was 3, and he taught me a lot about gardening. And my mother was a gardener too. I just fell in love with what I realized later were the great cycle of life, from spring to fall through summer, winter, all of the different things that were growing and dying. And later, of course, that is where I realized it was a very sacred thing to me, a very holy thing for me, and something that is part of my spirituality. And I say that from a spiritual point of view because I am someone who is spiritual. But what I mean by that is that when I am in a garden, or when I am in the act of gardening, I feel such a connection to the universe, such a connection to God. I often ask myself, why is it that I am such a believer when I'm gardening, and then when I'm not, sometimes not so much.
So is that, because people talk about green spirituality, is what you just talked about your understanding of green spirituality?
I think it is, but I think before we talk about green spirituality, it's really important, for me at least, to have an expanded definition of what gardening is to begin with. I think there are a lot of stereotypes. We all kind of have our ideas of what gardening is. But gardening needs to have an expanded definition, because I think that all of us, every single person, has a connectedness to the earth. And gardening really is something that's beautiful. And all people have a response to that, which is beautiful. And so everyone can have that connection. And thus, that would be the green spirituality. But we really need to broaden that definition of what gardening is. You hear the term thrown about a lot, but everyone's definition is different. Some people, it's a religious thing. Something that's a spiritual thing. Some things would never use the term green spirituality. They would just use, greening of the earth or eco-friendly. I think all of that is good, but the essential thing is to understand that gardening creates deep, deep connections to the earth, um, and you have a visceral response to that.
So you mentioned a little bit briefly there about how people can access gardening in a way that works for their lives. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? Like if somebody really wants to include plants and flowers in their world to to richen and deepen not only their daily life but their spirituality as well. How can they do that?
I think there are lots of ways that it can be done. Everything from just buying and arranging flowers into your life, or looking around and seeing what's happened with your neighbors. You're looking at your neighbor's yard, something like. The first and most important thing to do is to find what you love. To take a minute when you see something that catches your eye that's beautiful, and to ask yourself, well, why am I reacting this way? What is it about this that I find beautiful? And using that as a jumping off point to garden. A lot of people don't have the ability to garden, maybe because they live in the city and they only have a balcony or a windowsill, but they could still, look at gardening books or watch gardening shows. I don't know if you remember that movie, Fried Green Tomatoes,
Yeah, sure.
where the woman pasted all of those hundreds of photos of flowers around her bed. That to me is an act of gardening, that you're recognizing the beauty around you and you're having a reaction to it. So there are a lot of ways that people can do it. I think sometimes people think of gardening as only having a plot of land, working it, or planting things around your house. They don't want to be bothered with the work and the discipline involved. It doesn't need to be that way. That what we're talking about here is that recognition of beauty and that connection, which connects you to the earth. And that can be as simple as sitting back and admiring the arrangement on your table, or putting in 2 acres of corn, or reading a garden magazine, or going to a flower show, or just looking at what's around you in your neighborhoods, or wherever you happen to be. Those are acts of gardening. So is recognizing where your food comes from. Being a little inquisitive on what's the difference between this and organic food, and how does that make a difference in my life? That's an act of gardening. I think that I guess I'm calling for radical acts of gardening. There are people, say, yes, I am a gardener and I am connected. And it isn't necessarily that you're, actually have your hands in dirt, although that's a good way to start as well.
I love that, radical acts of gardening. Such a
Thank
good
you.
way to put it. And I'm thinking in terms of all the, like, one thing you do is post a lot of photos of flowers that you take photos of on Facebook. And when I see those, it really is sacred. I look at them and there's such beauty, and you're sharing something that you saw and took this photo of. And so that's another way that people can do this. But I'm curious to know, as when I started out this interview, I was saying I chose you to be our first living spirit because of what you do share with the world, love, art, beauty. And I'm so curious to learn how you intend to have gardening be a part of your ministry. Like, do you have plans for anything specifically that you're going to do with this?
I do have plans. I've been a gardener for my whole life. It's only been in the last few years that I started thinking of it as a ministry. And that has been something that has developed slowly. But I realized that by giving flowers to people, by helping people create gardens, helping people create sacred spaces, helping people create altars, or doing things. I learned a lot in my trips to Mexico, especially on how to build altars for Day of the Dead and what the symbolism was for the flowers. So what I would like to do is start offering workshops on different aspects of gardening. I think part of it is sharing those experiences with others. You mentioned photography, and photography is something, it is in and through taking photos of flowers that I actually became a photographer. And why did I do that? It's because I wanted to share with others that sensational beauty that I was experiencing. And photography is such a beautiful medium because it's the only art where you actually can see what the person is seeing. Other types of art, I mean, painting, you have your own interpretation of what that artist is doing. But I want people to see these magnificent, beautiful creations, these flowers that just you can't believe that these things, they're there. They're there for what? For our pleasure. So we help them, they help us. There's all kinds of connections going on there, and I hope to use a lot of this stuff in future workshops, specifically with using the seasons and perhaps focusing on some of the holidays and how people can bring, because that seems to be a time when people are festive and decorating anyway, and maybe a way that you could bring some of that green spirituality in to yourself and share it with your family and friends at that time.
Yeah, and it's when you talk about sharing, my thought is that this is something that people can do together, and when I think about the definition of religion, and not that this is all about religion or spirituality, but religion as binding together or bringing together, and I think of gardening, plants, flowers as a way to really connect with others, whether it's family members, friends, your partner, your spouse. And and that's such a beautiful thing to do. When I'm talking about partners and spouses, it gets me to the next question that I have is: do you feel like there is a difference between the way men and women respond to or include flowers and gardening and plants in their lives?
I do. I think that it's a cultural thing, and here in the United States, and I think in Canada as well, often it's almost taboo for men to like flowers, to like beautiful, pretty things. That somehow it's seen as not being masculine, and I think that prevents people from actually exploring this whole idea of green spirituality. And it's really an interesting cultural question because if this is only in a female domain, what does that mean? What does that mean societally, culturally? So there is that issue, and it's different in every culture all around the world. I have friends in South America that a man would never, ever, ever, receive flowers, give flowers. These are restricted sometimes just to funerals and that. And that brings up another point where oftentimes people don't have an interest in gardening because they associate flowers and plants with particular events. Specifically, a lot of people I know with funerals. The only time they see many, many flowers are at a funeral. And so they make that association, and it's a negative association. So they're not interested. Maybe not even interested in the flower, but the sense itself. I have one friend who insists that she hates carnations because they remind her of her mother's funeral. Those are the flowers she saw, but it wasn't necessarily the scent that she was smelling. And so these are complex things. But I think that we need to re-look at this, especially with this expanded definition of gardening. And I think that we have to look at, well, what is the common denominator? And the common denominator is all of us have the ability, and we do respond to beauty. And that in gardening, in nature, there's just tremendous beauty. And we all respond to that. And so what I always say and do when I'm working with people and talking to people about gardening is, what is it that you love? What is it that really just sort of sets your heart on fire when you're out in nature? And and it could be just a giant oak tree, or it could be a beautiful lawn, or it could be azaleas in the spring or lilies in the summer, or the starkness of empty trees in the winter. But the starting point is recognizing where the beauty is. And I think that we can get through all of those other differences and really usher in new way of thinking. And that's what we really need to do. And you start with younger people as well. That's why it's so important to garden with children, to teach them not only where their food comes from, but to teach them that, the beauty of flowers is something we relate to, but also flowers are beautiful because they're attracting pollinators. And pollinators are so important, not just for the flowers, but also for the food that we eat. And that there's a connectedness there that's really important to to make people be aware of. And the younger you do it, I think the better off we'll be.
Yeah, it's really such a fascinating topic, and also really such a beautiful art form. And if people have further questions, they want to chat with you more about this or talk to you about ways that you might be able to help them incorporate flowers, gardening, plants into their lives, what is the best way for them to reach you?
I would just say you can email me at symbolik@yahoo.com. That's Symbolik. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody. I can email you, call you. We could do a Zoom. But whatever your thoughts are and what you're thinking about, how you can bring it in, I would be glad to talk to you about it and see what we can do. I think it's an important thing. And again, it is a ministry. And, as part of a ministry, it has to do with building up community. And I look at the world as this great community, and this is something that everyone could do. You don't need to be spiritual. You don't have to have any, particular beliefs whatsoever. You just have to have that human love of beauty. And that's the best starting point you can have. So Symbolik@yahoo.com.
Perfect. And thank you so much for being here today, and also for sharing your wisdom, your love with us. And really, you are changing the world, my friend. And I have a lot of respect for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. And you're changing the world too through all of your energy and the community that you're building. I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope that we can work together soon.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.